There's someone sitting on the edge of the shelter platform, right there at the lip of the wood, just sitting in the rain, not shaking off the water, not unbuckling anything, not making a single sound except talking in my voice, my actual voice, the same flat O I've had my whole life, the stutter I get when I'm worn thin. It said it was cold. It said it remembered the birches from this morning, the ones with the scar shaped like a door. And I never told a soul about those birches. I have to stay still. I have to stay perfectly, absolutely, completely still. Settle in. Pull the blankets close and let the static fade as we journey into the deepest, unmapped hollows of the mountains. Welcome back to the redacted archives. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over the high ridgeline in the last week of October, a quiet so total and so weighted that you begin to feel it pressing against the inside of your chest like cold river water slowly rising. I had been walking for 11 days. 11 days alone on a remote stretch of trail where the blazes had faded to the color of old bone, and the undergrowth had grown so thick that the path itself felt less like a trail cut through wilderness and more like a wound the mountain had never chosen to heal. My pack sat heavy between my shoulder blades, 53 pounds of everything a body needs and nothing more, and my boots had soaked through on day 3 and never truly dried again. The sky, by mid-afternoon, had gone the color of a fresh bruise. Not ordinary autumn gray, but something deeper. A purple-green dark that pressed down against the ridgeline like a hand laid flat against a wound. The temperature had been dropping since noon. I could feel it in my knuckles, in the thin skin over my cheekbones, in the way my breath moved out ahead of me in thick, reluctant curls. The trail map showed nothing useful for at least 7 more miles. No shelter markers, no lean-to symbols, no fire roads. Just contour lines pressed so tightly together they looked like the whorls of a fingerprint, and a vast, unnamed stretch of dark green. There is a thing older hikers will tell you, if you find them at the right hour beside the right kind of fire, their voices low and careful the way certain kinds of knowledge demand. They call it the rule of the ridge, and it is simply this. When the white-out fog drops low enough to swallow the roots beneath your boots, not your ankles, not your knees, but the very roots, the very ground, you stop walking. You do not push on. You do not trust the nearest blaze or convince yourself the slope ahead is anything like the grade you walked this morning. You stop, and you find walls, any walls at all, and you get inside them. Because in that fog, in that mountain dark, The trail no longer belongs to you. Something older than cartography has quietly reclaimed it. The fog came down at 4:15. The light died so suddenly and so completely I thought for one terrible second something had gone wrong with my eyes. One moment the trail was there ahead of me, pale and brown through the timber. Then the cloud descended, unhurried, like a curtain drawn from far above, and the roots beneath my boots disappeared, and I stopped walking. The temperature dropped 11 degrees in 20 minutes. The first fat, cold drops of rain tapped against my rain jacket almost patiently. I left the trail. I pushed east through skeletal rhododendron thickets that dragged cold fingers across my face, through stands of second-growth hemlock where the needle mat swallowed my footsteps whole, following the slope down into the hollow below the ridgeline where the wind died and the cold pooled, and the fog sat so thickly between the trunks that each tree appeared and dissolved like a thought you cannot hold. And then I smelled it. Old char, old wood, old iron. The particular scent of a structure that human beings have sheltered inside for a very long time. 10,000 small fires, 10,000 damp jackets, 10,000 long nights with rain hammering overhead. The shelter materialized out of the fog the way a word surfaces when you've been searching for it. 3 walls of stacked chestnut log, gone so dark with age the wood looked less like timber and more like something the mountain had simply grown that way. The roof was corrugated tin, so old and oxidized the rust had healed over itself into rough beauty. The platform floor, wide warped planks rising 18 inches from the earth, was empty. No trail register, no bear box, no fire ring, no name carved anywhere. Just the 3 walls and the roof, and the dark hollow closing in on all sides. I pressed my palms flat against the platform wood and felt the depth of it. The years worked into the grain, the moisture of 100 seasons absorbed until the boards felt less like wood and more like the memory of wood. I checked the walls for gaps, checked the angle of the overhang against the wind. The structure was old but sound, and I was going to be alive in the morning. I unclipped my pack and let it drop to the planks with a sound like a tired body finally sitting down. Making camp inside a 3-sided shelter at the front edge of a hard mountain storm is a ritual that leaves very little room for thought, which I have always believed is entirely by design. The hands need something to do. The mind needs the immediate and the concrete so that it does not drift toward the larger questions the mountains tend to raise in a person left too long alone in them. I hung the small tarp across the open face of the shelter, staked at the corners with trekking poles pushed into the soft earth below. I set the camp stove on the platform boards, a small backpacking unit that clicks to life with a soft brew hiss. Balanced the titanium pot of filtered water on the burner and stripped off my soaked outer layers while I waited. Rain jacket, wet soft shell, damp base layer. I hung them on the small, square-headed iron nails driven into the back wall. Hand-cut nails, I noticed. Old enough to say something about this place that I did not quite want to hear. I pulled on the dry thermal layer I'd kept sealed in a waterproof stuff sack for exactly this kind of night. And the warmth of it against my cold skin was so sudden that I exhaled slowly with the relief of something fundamental being restored. The water boiled. I ate a freeze-dried meal that tasted of the concept of food rather than food itself, and watched the rain beyond the tarp thicken until the individual drops were no longer visible, and the world became a single, seamless gray wall that had replaced everything else. When I was finished, I packed the stove and pot away and sat for a moment in the pure, thunderous dark, listening to the rain on the tin roof with a feeling that was almost peace. Then I unrolled the sleeping bag, a heavy down mummy bag rated to -20 degrees, a cocoon of warmth that climbing into felt less like going to sleep and more like going somewhere else entirely. I eased myself inside, drew the cinch cords tight at the hood until only a narrow oval of open air remained around my face, and slowly drew the zipper upward, from hip to chin, sealing the cold out, pulling the storm flap over the zipper teeth, and lying back against the sleeping pad in the accumulating warmth of my own body. Rain hammered the tin roof with a sound like continuous applause. The world beyond the top was an absolute seamless black. I closed my eyes. I was nearly asleep, right at that dissolving edge where the surface of consciousness becomes water, and you are just beginning to slip beneath it. When I heard the footsteps, they were heavy and slow, coming from the north side of the hollow where the thickets were densest. They moved through the mud with a soft, rhythmic squelching, the specific sound of a boot heel pressing into saturated earth and pulling free again, approaching with the unhurried certainty of something that already knows where it is going. I had pulled the zipper to my chin. I lay still. The footsteps reached the platform edge and stopped. For a long moment there was only the rain, enormous on the roof above me, and the interior darkness of the shelter, and my own heartbeat, which I became suddenly and acutely aware of in the way you only become aware of your heartbeat when it is relevant information. Then the platform boards shifted with a low wooden groan, and a considerable weight settled onto the lip of the platform at the open front edge of the shelter. I could see its outline through the gap at the bottom of the top. Sitting with its back to me, facing out into the driving rain, rounded shoulders, hands resting on its knees, the silhouette of a rain jacket, dark pants, boots, a pack frame, entirely, completely human in its shape. It did not shake the water off, It did not unbuckle its hip belt or shrug its pack loose or reach for a headlamp. It simply sat at the platform's edge, facing the storm. And it was still in a way that no person arriving out of an hour's hiking in hard rain and mountain dark is ever still. Not the stillness of exhaustion or of catching one's breath. The stillness of something that has no breath to catch. I did not move. I watched through my lashes in the flat dark. The figure sat for perhaps 4 minutes without speaking. The rain fell. The tin roof continued its enormous, hypnotic roar. And then it spoke. The voice that came out of it was mine, not like mine, not an approximation or a studied resemblance. Mine. The precise, flat vowels of the mid-state accent I had spent 31 years developing. The slight drag on consonants that surfaces when I am cold and tired. The soft hesitation, barely a stutter, a brief doubling of the first syllable that appears when I have been alone for more than a week and my social machinery begins to rust. My voice coming from a body that was not mine. It said it was cold, in the exact way I say that, the word bitten off a little short, the complaint carried more in tone than in the word itself. Then it described the birches, the cluster of white-barked trees below the first switchback on the morning's climb, the angle of early light on their bark, the scar on one trunk in the rough shape of a door. I had not written any of that in my journal. I had not said it aloud. I had held it quietly inside my own mind like a small, kept thing. And now it was being recited back to me in my own voice by something sitting in the dark at the edge of a shelter on a mountain. It said it wanted me to unzip the bag. It said there was room. It said the cold was in the joints of its fingers, in that deep-seated way that cold settles into joints after a long day on the ridge. It said all of this with such exact fidelity to the patterns of my own speech that some wordless part of my brain kept trying to receive the sound as normal, kept trying to process it as my own thinking made accidentally audible. But I had not moved. My lips had not parted. The voice was coming from outside. I stayed absolutely still. Cinch cords tight at the hood, zipper at my chin, hands inside the bag, breathing as shallow and as silent as I could manage, which was not very silent, because fear has its own audible quality, a shallow and trembling quality, and I was afraid. It spoke again and again, the same memories, the same complaints, the same quiet begging. Let me in. It's cold. There's room. I'm so tired. offered back to me in my own voice with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry. The hours passed with a slowness that had texture and weight. Time stretched until it lost its ordinary character and became something you moved through rather than something that moved past you. The rain did not relent. In the deep middle of the night it deepened further, and the tin roof grew so loud that the voice had to raise itself to be heard above it, and something about hearing my own voice raised, hearing my own cadences at the volume I associate with alarm, made everything considerably worse. Then, at some unmeasured hour, the figure turned its head. Not the way a person turns to look over a shoulder. No shift of torso, no roll of spine. The head simply rotated, slowly and smoothly, 180 degrees backward, the way a gear turns on an axle, until it faced directly into the dark interior of the shelter. The eyes were wide open, completely, perfectly unblinking. They caught the faint pulse of my headlamp's charging indicator, the small red LED that pulsed every few seconds when the lamp was off, and reflected it back as two identical pinprick points of light, floating motionless in the darkness, equidistant and patient, without expression of any kind. I held my breath. I held it until pressure built behind my eyes and my vision began to darken at the edges, until the sleeping bag became the whole of the world. Its warmth, the smell of old down and body heat, the absolute enclosure of it, and I held it still, because something in me understood, without evidence, without reason, that breath was the wrong thing to offer in that moment. The rain fell on the roof. The hollow breezed around me. The head rotated back, slowly, smoothly, facing the storm again. The two small points of reflected light vanished. The voice returned, lower now, quieter, almost gentle. It said it was tired. It said it had been walking for so very long, in the fog and in the dark, for longer than I could imagine. And it was cold, and it only wanted to rest. It only wanted to be let in. I did not answer. I lay in the warm dark of the bag and breathed as quietly as I could manage. And the rain measured out the hours on the tin roof in a continuous, enormous count, with no number and no end. Dawn does not arrive so much as it reasserts itself. Not a brightening, but a slow refusal of the dark to hold. The first thin, colorless light filtered through the fog and through the tarp and into the low interior of the shelter. Not warmth, Not comfort, just light, the reluctant kind, a kind the mountain gives up only when it has no other choice. The figure at the platform edge was gone. I lay still for a long count of minutes, watching the empty space. The rain had softened to a slow drip from the overhang edge. The fog in the hollow was pulling back from the tree roots and the understory, like something retreating, though not, I noticed, to any true absence. At the edge of the platform, where the figure had been sitting, there was a pool of standing water. Not rain spatter, not roof runoff. A pool the shape and size of something that had sat in the rain for a very long time, and then simply ceased to be there. The boards around it were dry. I packed my gear in silence. I did not look back at the hollow as I climbed out of it and found the trail and walked north. And I walked until I reached a road crossing 6 miles on, and I did not stop again on the trail that season. But sometimes now, in the deep quiet of a still night when sleep is close, right there at that dissolving edge, I hear it rise up from somewhere below, the way certain things drift up from cold, dark water. My own voice, asking to come in, telling me it's cold, telling me there is room.